tell you something about Raincoast that you may not know, and that is a lot of Raincoast members have been a part of Raincoast for going on 20 years. And I'm not sure how much interaction you have with environmental groups in your day-to-day lives, but that is a very rare thing indeed, to have a team of people that like or love one another that much and work together so well and share a passion and a vision of doing good work in a good way. And I suspect we'll be doing that for the rest of our careers together. And a big part and kind of at the center of Raincoast is Misty MacDuffee. Christiana Valley is our executive director and a strong man, but we know behind or beside every strong man is a very strong woman, and that is Misty. Misty is one of my heroes and mentors and friends and colleagues, a really important person in my life for going on 20 years now, trained as a biologist. Very applied scientist. I mean, Misty is in the trenches of policy and moving the bar for wildlife and for salmon especially, as our director for the wild salmon program. Misty's been involved in I mean, just dozens and dozens of processes that occur in the real world. And trained as a scientist, she gathers, synthesizes, and communicates the kind of evidence that is needed to move the bar forward in the real world. So she's a real inspiration to us all, and I think she's going to inspire and inform you all right now. So please help me warmly welcome Misty MacDuffee.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you to everyone for coming out tonight, and our sponsors, Maple Leaf and Royal Bank. And I also want to thank Fred, because Fred really made this happen. We just get to show up. Fred does all the work. So, I'm going to start our story tonight with Kinder Morgan's proposal to expand the Trans Mountain pipeline and ship that oil from Alberta through the Salish Sea to foreign and Asian markets. Because up until Kinder Morgan initiated this proposal or initiative, Raincoast work, as Chris was describing, really was rooted in the Great Bear Rainforest and the Queen Charlotte Basin. And our efforts through over the last 10 years included a huge amount of work to stop Northern Gateway and oil tankers on the North Coast. But when Kinder Morgan filed their application to expand Trans Mountain, many of the concerns with Northern Gateway existed with Kinder Morgan and shipping oil in tankers through the Salish Sea. So you can't clean up an oil spill in either location. And you have these natural hazards in the north, but you have high traffic volume in the south, both of which contribute to an increased risk of accidents. And the concern for many species means the consequences of oil spills in both locations. So becoming an intervener in Kinder Morgan was the logical next step, and it was really the beginning of Raincoast's work down here in the Salish Sea. But we changed our strategy with Trans Mountain when we became interveners. And on Northern Gateway, we weighed in on a lot of animals, both on the marine and the terrestrial side. But in the end, we only went to court on 2 of those species. So for Kinder Morgan, we zoned in on 4 strategic wildlife groups: marine birds, Pacific herring, wild salmon, especially with a heavy focus on those in the Fraser, and then, of course, our salmon-eating killer whales. So as many of you know, these are one of the best studied populations of whales in the world. And thanks to scientists on both sides of the Canadian and the US border, we know the identity of every single whale in these 3 pods. And we know the relationship between every whale and every other whale within their pods. And we know that these are whales that have evolved with a distinct diet, a distinct language, and a distinct culture. And it's also widely understood that these southern residents are a population that has seen virtually no growth in the 15 years since they've been listed as endangered under Canada's Species at Risk Act. And the threats to these whales have also been broadly identified. Their food availability, its threats from vessel noise and disturbance, and it's also the contaminant exposure that they get through their salmon diet. And their vulnerability to oil spills was also identified in Canada's recovery strategy for these whales. So given these recognized threats, and given the fact that Trans Mountain, Kinder Morgan, that oil tankers mean the increase in vessel traffic means an increase in noise and disturbance, and given the fact that the cargo that those ships are carrying is oil, and given the fact that Trans Mountain's route overlays virtually all of southern resident critical habitat, which you can see, step away from the mic, which you can see outlined in the red hash marks. So given all of those, and the enormity of risk and the impacts from the daily transit of oil tankers, southern resident killer whales quickly became the focus of our work on Kinder Morgan. But to make a submission to the federal government and its National Energy Board that was going to be meaningful in terms of evaluating the risks associated with oil tankers, we wanted to do some fairly sophisticated analysis. So Raincoast amassed an international team of scientists from Canada, from the US, and from Britain that had expertise in everything from understanding killer whale demographics to marine mammal acoustics, and specialists in modeling endangered populations. And we brought this team together to undertake what's called a population viability analysis. And really, that's just a fancy term for a model that allows its users to understand and rank the threats that endangered populations face. So the value in this is that it can first provide a baseline scenario that can look 100 years into the future, that given the existing set of conditions that killer whales now face in the Salish Sea. And second, it allows us to look at future population states and what happens if we increase or decrease those threats. But to do a PVA, we really need to be able to describe the relationship between the whales and each one of those stressors. So whether it's noise and disturbance, or food availability, or contaminants, we have to know more specifically how that population interacts with those threats. But before I get into these current threats that are preventing recovery of southern resident killer whales today, we have to keep in mind the legacy effects that this population experienced because of the events, the experience from the live capture fishery that took almost 50 individuals out of the southern resident population and sold them to aquariums around the world. And many of you are probably familiar with the Blackfish movie that really featured the history of this population. So the removal of that many individuals from this population had an incredible effect both biologically and culturally. Biologically, it reduced the number of whales to a very low number, less than 70 individuals. And it also removed important young females. So small populations function really differently than large, diverse populations. And they're much more susceptible to random events, everything from changes in sex ratios, or a drop in birth rates, or an exposure to an oil spill, or change in sex ratios. All of these things are events that large populations can absorb, but small populations can't. But the removal of those individuals didn't just leave its mark biologically, it also left its mark culturally, in terms of the loss of strong bonds and the social cohesion that existed between members of those family units. And it's this culture and these relationships between animals, and Chris was starting to hint at this, and whether it's killer whales or wolves or elephants, that we as humans are finally starting to recognize and appreciate at a much deeper and more profound level than we ever have. So one of the places that this culture is reflected is in the existence of menopause in killer whales, where females continue to live long after their reproductive years. The whale in this photo is J2, or more commonly and affectionately known as Granny. And she was the matriarch of her family unit, which was J-Pod. And she was believed to be more than 90 years old when she died earlier this year. But Granny hadn't actually had a calf in more than 40 years. And this concept of postmenopausal females that live for decades past their reproductive years is very rare outside of humans. It exists in pilot whales and some other species, but it's very unique. And the reason, as determined by this amazing team of scientists from England that we actually have been working with on the PVA, is that older females hold ecological knowledge, particularly of salmon migration routes and feeding grounds, and they lead the pods, especially in years of low salmon abundance. So if we move back into the threats again, the existing threats that are preventing recovery, food supply is one that we know the most about, and we know what we know largely to the efforts of people like Dr. John Ford and his colleagues at the Pacific Biological Station in Nanaimo. And what we know is that Chinook is really the favorite salmon of southern resident killer whales. And it's probably their favorite food because these fish are large, they have a high fat content, and they're available almost in coastal waters almost year round. And one of the reasons that, that when killer whales sort of start to arrive, where we really start to see them more frequently in the spring, is they're arriving at the same time as those Fraser River Chinook migrations are beginning. And so that killer whales arrive, and some of their most important feeding grounds are moving through the San Juan and the Gulf Islands as those Chinook are on their way back into the Fraser River. So what these figures are showing is that actual strong relationship between the abundance of Chinook salmon and the vital rates of whales, so birth rates, mortality, and survival. So when Chinook abundance is higher, birth rates go up, survival goes up, and mortality goes down. But when Chinook abundance drops, mortality goes up, survival goes down, and birth rates go down. And this is really the work of Canadian scientists at Pacific Biological Station. And then the second threat that we need to be able to understand and rank in our population viability analysis is noise and disturbance. So if we think about how a killer whale navigates through its world, or actually better, if we think about how humans navigate through our world, we're very visual. We rely on our eyes and our sight. But killer whales, their world is acoustic. They rely on sound. And they have to produce and they have to listen to sounds to carry out their basic life functions. So their ability to navigate, their ability to communicate with their pod members, their ability to find and select mates, and importantly, their ability to find and capture food all relies on their ability to hear and to produce sounds. So when killer whales are actually hunting for salmon, they echolocate, which is a biosonar, and they can echolocate on a salmon, and they can determine the size of that salmon. They can determine, where that salmon is in the water column, and they can communicate with their other pod members on isolating and capturing that fish. So when we look at the ways that vessel noise can affect their ability to communicate and listen, it really happens through three ways. So one is that the frequencies that killer whales are echolocating in and communicating in can be masked by the frequencies of engines and propellers. Second, the noise can reduce what's called a whale's communication space. So in the absence of noise, say a whale could hear and be heard over an area of a couple of 100 square kilometers. But when noise increases, that space reduces that they can communicate over and be heard. And third is that vessels in close proximity to whales are known they can change their behavior. So they can go from being in one activity state, say feeding or resting, into another activity state. And so really what noise and disturbance do is they act indirectly to reduce the consumption of salmon that whales need to survive. And when it comes to Kinder Morgan, right, and we're looking at some of the killer whales, the heart of their critical habitat through Harrow Strait, they're now in the presence of vessels about 85% of the time. And just with Trans Mountain, they go to being in the presence of vessels more than 92% and sometimes up to 100% of the time. So another threat that we want to examine, and perhaps the most obvious one when we're talking about shipping oil on oil tankers, is oil spills. And so what this figure is showing us is the likelihood of oil presence in those dark to gray shaded areas based on a spill that was modeled by Kinder Morgan for 15 days after a hypothetical tanker ran aground on Arachne Reef in northern Harrow Strait. And then we overlaid those probabilities onto the critical habitat of southern resident killer whales. And what you can see is that spills occur in one of the highest risk sections of the tanker route, and in the 90 and 95% probabilities for oil presence. And this is really the heart of killer whale critical habitat. And then what we really know about how oil spills and killer whales interact comes from what we learned in the 1989 Exxon Valdez oil spill in Prince William Sound in Alaska. And of the two populations of killer whales, there was transient marine mammal-eating whales, the big killer whales, and the resident population. Both of those populations of whales experienced very high mortality. The transient population, the mammal eaters, lost all of their breeding females. And because killer whale culture is the way that it is, they won't recruit any new family members to their family. So the whales in this transient population are what we call functionally extinct. When those individuals are gone, that lineage and that population will be gone. In the resident salmon-eating killer whales, they also experienced high mortality, and it's taken 30 years for those whales to recover since the spill. Okay, so I have to show one table. But what this table is showing, and I'm going to highlight some parts of it, is the likelihood of killer whale recovery under various scenarios. So, up at the top is our base case, the existing conditions now, if under existing food availability, under existing noise, and existing contaminants. And what it's showing is that killer whales are on a long, slow decline. Their chance of being functionally extinct, which we class, or everybody classes in this case, less than 30 whales, a number from which they can't recover, is 7% in 100 years. Actually, our scenario is more optimistic than Fisheries and Oceans scenario, and because their scenario suggested 50% extinction within 100 years. But we've considered more factors than they have. So ours is more optimistic. But importantly, when we're talking about Trans Mountain, is that just the noise, no oil spills, no risk of ship strikes, noise alone increases the risk of extinction by almost 25%. But the other really important message in this is the role of food availability. And we took a look at a couple of scenarios, and increasing Chinook availability above what's called a baseline level by either 10 or 15% reduces the chance of extinction in the next 100 years to 0. And that's a very powerful piece of information and really speaks to the importance of food availability. So the interesting thing is that we aren't the only ones that have concluded this, even though our analysis is more detailed and specific. Both Kinder Morgan and the National Energy Board agree that noise effects from Trans Mountain are adverse, significant, and can't be mitigated, and ultimately increase their risk of extinction. So our lawsuits to stop Trans Mountain were really filed on this basis, that the decision to approve Trans Mountain is unlawful, and it violates Canada's Species at Risk Act and its legislation that protects the critical habitat of killer whales. But importantly, I would add that our actions, whether it's trying to stop Kinder Morgan in the case tonight, we're also interveners on the expansion at Roberts Bank for Terminal 2, and we're doing other things to prevent increases in shipping in the Salish Sea. But these are not actions that will facilitate recovery. These are actions that are holding the line and preventing conditions within the Salish Sea from getting any worse for killer whales. That's all these actions are doing, is allowing things so that they're not getting worse, so that we can then set the stage for recovery. But to recover whales, we actually have to improve those conditions within critical habitat. And the most important finding from our population viability analysis is that these whales can recover if we give them the conditions and the habitat they need. So an increase in food availability and reductions in noise can enable not just the recovery, but the recovery to the point where they can meet the U.S. recovery target, which is just over a 2% growth rate for 28 years. And now that we have this information from the PVA and sort of an updated version of it as well, we know the actions that we need to take, and we know their potential to affect recovery. So this is really powerful information that didn't exist previously. And it really gives us a place, as Chris was talking about earlier, is that the investigation has led us to a place where we can inform from a much more powerful position. So rebuilding Chinook runs, curtailing certain fisheries, reducing noise and disturbance from vessel traffic, and stopping the pollutants that are flowing into the Salish Sea are all the next steps to facilitate recovery. And we're now working with our partners to develop and implement the details of these plans. So that's sort of where we are. We see where we need to be going from here, and we're bringing the teams together and the partners together to begin this. But I guess the other piece is, okay, so what can we do? What can you do? And there's a lot of other organizations that are starting up that actually the main one I'm thinking right now is the initiative from Salt Spring called Orca Soundings. And individuals, they've gotten people to take on each, to represent each one of the 78 southern residents, and are really trying to spread the word about what it is we need to do living within the Salish Sea to change how we're living within the Salish Sea. So we know that recovery is possible. We can see it from here, and right now when we're just getting ready to launch those initiatives. So I think I'm going to leave it there, because I think we have some time constraints. So thank you, and I'll hand it back to Chris, and